Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. I am here with a guest, as always, Jordan Reid of ESPN, joining me today on the program. Fresh off combine, fresh off mock draft. A lot of people, a lot of things going on right now. Jordan, how's it going?
It's good. The combine is always one of my favorite trips of the year just because it's like a big convention where everybody finally gets together and we get to see these prospects we've been talking about and watching on TV all year. We finally get to see all of them in one spot.
Yeah, we get to see all of them in one spot. You were there in Indy. Who were some of the players that kind of stuck out to you?
Well, this wide receiver class and the offensive tackle class is the two classes that we've been hyping up a whole bunch. And I wanted to see if they could live up to the hype. And I certainly thought they did. And I mean, you could start at the top. The two players that I thought were really impressive out the wide receiver group was Adney Mitchell of Texas and then also Brian Thomas Jr. of LSU. I was really impressed with both of those players. And then there were some other players that had really good combines, but those were the two at the wide receiver position that really stuck out. But the offensive tackle class on Sunday I thought was phenomenal. And I mean, you can go down the list of all the players in this top offensive tackle class from Joe Walt of Notre Dame to Olu Fashanu of Penn State to Lise Fuaga of Oregon State. Troy Fatanu of Washington is another that I thought was really impressive. So I thought both of the classes definitely lived up to the hype.
Yeah, I mean, just a bunch of it feels like record-breaking athletic testing. They always say in terms of the 40-yard dash that like 4.5 might be the new 4.6, right?
Yeah,
Just you
yeah.
get these athletic freaks kind of every year in the combine. I personally loved my guy went to Rutgers, Max Melton. He tested like a freak at the broad jump, and then you have a guy who's now in the top 50 of your mock draft in Penn State's Theo Johnson, and it seems like they're a school that produces guys that maybe don't have the most college production, but then they end up testing and going super high in the draft, like you have
Yeah.
in this class. I want to ask you, I guess, a philosophical question in terms of how you write this mock draft, and this, I guess, directly relates to your indie experience. How do you kind of parse what's real and what's not? Because you have three quarterbacks going in the top four, and then Marvin Harrison Jr. to the Cardinals. We heard a lot of J.J. McCarthy at four, potential steam. We also heard some two quarterbacks in the top four, and then maybe the Patriots go with Marvin Harrison Jr. So there's been a lot of noise. How would you kind of parse the noise in terms of what's real and what's not in terms of when you write these mock drafts?
I think that's the toughest part of the business, honestly, just because you don't know what somebody is telling you is true and you don't know if they're just leading you on with some stuff. So I think you kind of have to look at what I call trends with teams and then what are some of the philosophical things that they may have done in the past. You try to attach it to some of the prospects that align with some of those philosophical approaches, and then also match that up with some of the things that you may be hearing. For like example, the Chargers, just looking at the roster construction, Jim Harbaugh, Greg Roman, Jesse Minter, some of the things that they have done, whether it was at Michigan or what Roman has done in the past in Baltimore. And, just listen to Joe Hortiz in his press conference. I would be really surprised if they don't trade back just because I think there's going to be a lot of roster turnover on both sides of the ball, especially at receiver. And then they're going to have some things to correct on defense too. And, I think they're one of the most intriguing teams inside the top 10 just because, yes, you could take an offensive tackle at 5, whether it's Joe Alt or Olu Fashanu, but then we're doing the whole flipping them to right tackle thing. And how do we feel about Trey Pipkins? And then also, do you take Brock Bowers or do you take one of these wide receivers? So I think to alleviate some of those concerns, you just trade back and you feel a little bit more comfortable taking a receiver or offensive tackle or even a tight end there. So there's a lot of things that the Chargers can take into in consideration. But to answer your original question, I don't think there's no correct answer to it just because
Mm-hmm.
there's some guys that maybe trying to hype up another guy because they love another guy and they want you to
Yeah.
pump out something so they can hide their guy and they slip to him. So that's the tough part of navigating all the smoke, I would say.
Yeah, or maybe some teams in 5 and 6 in the periphery who are going, yeah, we love JJ McCarthy. Let Marvin
Yeah,
Harrison Jr. fall to us.
absolutely.
Yeah, definitely lying season to a degree. Getting into the Chargers options, so you have them in this mock draft trading down to 9 with the Chicago Bears and ultimately selecting Brock Bowers, who is a great tight end prospect and one originally recruited by Jim Harbaugh, which I find an interesting aspect of all of this. Um, what I guess stands out about him when you watch him on tape and why you think he would be a particularly good fit for the Chargers?
Well, it's just the dynamic ability that Brock has. And I always say this: Brock isn't going to give you the versatility like a George Kittle or some of these other type tight ends that are really good inline players. But if you treat him as a bigger or big wide receiver, I think you're going to appreciate the value that he brings. So, it's the whole Kyle Pitts debate thing of how you play him or
Mhm.
how to utilize him. But I think they're very different. He's not nearly as big as Pitts, but as far as the explosiveness and how you can use him or utilize him as a wide receiver, I think you definitely can get a lot of value from Brock Bowers. Now, there's going to be the whole positional value debate with him and whether you take him inside the top 10. I think he's worthy of a top 10 selection just because of what he brings you right away. And then I don't think the Chargers are going to give up on Quentin Johnston, even though the early signs aren't very good. They're going to give him every opportunity that it takes to prove that he was worthy of that first round pick. And I know it's a new regime, but you're not going to give up on a player that quickly. And then also, I'm sure you know this already, but the two highest cap hits for wide receivers in the league are Mike Williams and Keenan Allen. So one of those guys obviously are not going to be on the roster next year. If I had to guess, it probably is going to be Mike Williams. So now you have a huge void to fill for another wide receiver. And I think Bowers can give you value in that Mike Williams type of role.
Mhm. And, Joe Hortiz, something I thought was interesting. He was asked, I think at his combine press conference, about what he felt about the depth of the offensive line class. And then, he wasn't asked about it, but then he said, oh, wow, this wide receiver class is really deep too. And that stuck out to me just in terms of, my preference, I think, with five right now, if they were to stick there, is to take one of those wide receivers. And then, when you trade back, I think you get into Bowers, offensive line, certainly one of the whoever's left kind of a wide receiver discussion. But it certainly seems like, and Joe Hortiz also mentioned comp picks a lot. So he's definitely attempting one way or another to acquire kind of the most draft capital he can. And I do think that has led people into the trade back, kind of theories. Are you kind of trade down no matter what for the Chargers, in some of these mock drafts, or are there some prospects, maybe like a Marvin Harrison Jr., who you called a statue builder type prospect, where you would go, I don't know if I want to, trade down out of that one?
It just depends on the deals that are presented to you. I think things get really interesting if Marvin goes at 3 to New England,
Hmm.
assuming they stay there and don't select a quarterback. If they take Marvin, then what does Arizona do? And then, of course, that leaves the Chargers in a great situation because one of Drake May or Jaden Daniels is going to fall to that 5th overall pick. So I think things get really interesting if Marvin ends up going number 3 overall. But for me, I mean, if Marvin's there, you absolutely turn the card in as soon as that 4th team is off of the clock. You don't waste any time at all turning the card in there. And I feel the same about Malik Neighbors. I think Malik Neighbors would be a great selection for them just because they need help on the perimeter. And then once again, one of Keenan Allen or Mike Williams is not going to be there. Mike Williams, I think, is the obvious choice between the two. So they're going to have a lot of roster turnover, and they need that young, dynamic receiver to pair with Justin Herbert, and that's exactly what Malik Neighbors is. So if all else fails, I would love to trade back as long as the deal is fair or what's presented to you is fair. But if you stick and pick, I will look to go wide receiver. And I think Malik Neighbors, realistically, assuming Marvin is not there, I think Malik Neighbors will be a great outcome.
Yeah. I want to get into your second round here. You have the Chargers at 37, up again on the board, picking Kamari Lassiter after they traded down in the first round, but this is with their original pick. What are some of your quick thoughts maybe on this cornerback class, the types of guys that will be available there, and what maybe makes Lassiter at this pick a bit of a fit with Jesse Minter and what Jim Harbaugh will kind of want to do with this defense?
Well, I think through the first 3 rounds, the depth of the outside corner class is good. And we don't have a Sauce Gardner or a Derek Stingley or a Devin Weatherspoon in this class, somebody that's worthy of a top 5 to top 10 pick. I just don't see that guy in this class. But the depth of the outside group, I think, is really good through the first 3 rounds. I had him taking Kamari Lassiter in the second round, who I think is a really, really good prospect. It wouldn't surprise me if he goes as high as the Baltimore Ravens at number 30. I think that's really where his clock really starts. Just because of some big questions as far as his long speed, which he didn't run at the combine. We'll see if he does end up running at Georgia's Pro Day. I think he can answer a lot of questions with that. But the physicality that he brings, the versatility that he plays with, and just the smarts that he has to. And I think him and Ennis Rexstraw, I think those are your 2 best tackling corners overall in this group. And these are some of the things that Jesse Minter stressed when he was at Michigan. So I think Kamari will be a really good fit for what they're looking for from an outside corner perspective.
Yeah, and I'll also throw in this in terms of your, first round trade back scenarios. You obviously mentioned Bowers, and I think the betting favorite would probably be that if they trade back, they still do go offense. But Terrion Arnold is your number one corner in this draft class. I love him a lot too as a prospect. Uh, what would you kind of think of maybe say the Chargers are able to trade back into that Minnesota, 11 to 15 range, here in that group of picks, and maybe they take somebody like Terrion Arnold off the board?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be in favor of that just because you're getting extra draft capital and you get somebody who I have as a top 15 prospect. I think that 11 to 15 range, I think that's very fair for Thierry. And I think I had the Colts taking them at
Yeah.
15 in my latest mock draft. So that's right in the range of where I would feel comfortable taking them. But you gain extra draft capital and you get the top corner on the board. I think that'd be really good. Now you're starting to build a really respectable secondary with Derwin James, who I expect to come back and have a big year. And Jesse Minter's defense, I think he's really going to unleash him. Asante Samuel Jr., who showed some signs but still is a little bit inconsistent. But now you have Terrion Arnold, who you can play in the slot or even outside.
Yeah, and you mentioned Hortiz's kind of control over all this. Obviously, comes from that Ravens regime, and is going to want maybe as many picks as possible if he trades back. He's mentioned comp picks before. What do you kind of make of, I guess, the variable of all this in Jim Harbaugh, coming back to the pros now and sort of, what his influence is on this draft process? Because he said, in his introductory press conference, he wants Joe Hortiz to be the Batman in the offseason and take over in that aspect. But I obviously imagine, as much of a program builder as Jim Harbaugh is, he's going to be still very involved in terms of the draft and some of these free agency moves. What do you think he is more specifically looking for in terms of either offensive players with Greg Roman or defensive players with Jesse Minter?
Well, if you think about it, the philosophy of Roman, Harbaugh, and then also Hortiz, it aligns. They have a lot of similar traits that they look for: toughness, physicality, and of course, they want to run the ball. Like that's what they want to do. And if you think about all of Jim Harbaugh's teams, even going back to when he was with the 49ers, it's centered around running the ball. So I think they're going to address the trenches, whether it's, offensive tackle. Once again, it depends on how they feel about Trey Pipkins and him moving forward. But it wouldn't surprise me if they do go offensive tackle at some point, whether it's at 5 or if they go somewhere in the second round with somebody, or even the third round. I think there's a lot of depth in this offensive tackle class. A couple of defensive linemen would not surprise me, depending on what happens with Khalil Mack or Joey Bosa. They're probably going to need another edge defender. I know they like Tui Pelotu a lot, but I think he's more so of a situational guy that you want to have as your third rusher, just so you can keep him fresh and utilize him on third downs. But the building blocks are going to be somewhere in the trenches. That's something that is just their philosophy with Harbaugh, Roman, Jesse Minter, and then also just some things that Joe Hortiz has implemented when he was with the Ravens. I think they're going to try to bring over some of that toughness and physicality.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you mentioned that I guess Minter specifically is going to be looking for defensive backs with kind of a low missed tackle rate, or
Yeah.
specifically guys that are good tacklers, and that puts guys higher on the board and certainly puts some prospects lower on the board who maybe need more development in that area. Um, you know, Getting into maybe who are some of the mid round guys that maybe stick out to you as kind of fits right now? The one that I sort of see a lot of people, with the Michigan connection, sort of going to in the third or fourth round, is Blake Corum, who is available. I see that mocked to the Chargers all the time. But whether it's him or other prospects, whether it's Michigan or not Michigan, who do you see as just players that are philosophical fits with the Chargers, kind of in that mid round range?
Yeah, so I was at the combine. I was on the podcast with Matt Money Smith, and I said,
Mhm.
Matt, I'm going to speak this into existence on every single Chargers podcast that I'm on. And it's Braylon Allen
Yeah.
to the Chargers. It's just such a perfect fit, man. Like, I mean, Harbaugh saw him when he was in the Big Ten. He wants to run the ball. He sees this 6'2", 245 pounds, 235 pounds, 20-year-old just being an absolute sledgehammer in Greg Roman's offense. I think it's such a perfect fit. Now, you have to have a complementary back pair with him, just because you're not going to get a lot of value out of the passing game with him, just because that's not really what his game is. But if you're looking for that 2-down sledgehammer that can get you to tough yards and then break off some occasional explosive runs, I think he would be a really good fit in the Chargers offense. And then, of course, you have Blake Corum, who Harbaugh is very familiar with. So those two really come to mind, and there's plenty of others. I mean, Trey Benson, I think, would be a really good one. I think he probably goes somewhere in the second round. If they recoup some extra draft capital by trading back, maybe recouping an extra second or a third, I think Trey Benson would be a really good fit.
Yeah, you mentioned Braylon Allen, and I think his draft status is almost kind of like unprecedented, especially in the era of NIL, where players stay in college for longer, and we've even seen backs that could have gone into this draft that stayed in college, kind of like a Trevion Henderson, and to get an NFL running back with relatively less mileage on him, that's just turned 20 years old. I think with how the game is kind of going, that's kind of, yeah, like I said, unprecedented. And I think definitely from a downhill running game perspective, getting him into the fold would be, I think, massive for the Chargers. One of my favorite running backs who met with the Chargers apparently at, I think, both the Combine and the Senior Bowl is Troy's Kamani Vidal. I've been talking about him a lot, but he's one of these guys that I really liked in the process. And, personally, is kind of like my day 3 later round running back guy. I think Braylon Allen certainly will go a little bit earlier, but I think he would obviously make a lot of sense too. When you talk about getting into these later rounds here, what are the positions when you look at this Chargers roster that they will be, kind of looking for in the draft?
I mean, we already talked about running back. We talked about corner. I think edge rusher could be somewhere that
Yeah,
they look to address.
Khalil and Joey.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of edge rushers in this class that I like quite a bit. Let me pull up my list here just so I can make sure I get some good fits for the Chargers. I mean, Jonah Ellis of Utah, I think that's an obvious fit. He would be a really good one. Some later round guys, Mo Camara of Colorado State, Javon Solomon of Troy is another. And then if you're looking for a longer, lengthy type of edge rusher, Javante Jean-Baptiste of Notre Dame is another name that I think they'll like quite a bit. And then, I think they could double dip at corner. That would not surprise me at all. So this cornerback class is really intriguing, but I think the depth at the outside corner spot really drops off a cliff after the third round. But if you're looking for a nickel corner, I think this is a really, really good nickel corner class. We already talked about Max Melton a little bit earlier. Mike Sandersteele is another name that I think is going to be very popular in Chargers mock draft just because of the Jesse Minter connection. There's plenty of others. Renardo Green is another of Florida State that I like quite a bit. Jerrion Jones of Florida State. That's another name. Daquan Hardy of Penn State is another who had a fantastic combine. So if you're looking for a nickel corner, if they're looking to address that, I think that's another area where they could look in the later rounds.
Yeah, speaking of Mike Sandersteele, what do you kind of make? I know he's sort of been projected in like that second to third round range right now on a lot of consensus boards. What do you kind of make of the debate of a corner that is sort of a slot only corner, or some corners get tagged with having, outside slot flexibility? When you're kind of in this draft process, I guess how high would you maybe like take a guy that, obviously this is a prospect by prospect basis, that is kind of a maybe slot only corner like Sainer still is, versus taking a guy that kind of has both aspects of his game and can maybe has the physical intangibles to kind of play the outside?
Well, pound for pound, he's one of my favorite prospects overall in this draft class, just because I think he's the combination of everything that you want from a nickel corner. He's super tough. He's instinctive. He makes plays on the ball, and he has ball skills. And any Michigan game that you go to, he made plays in every single one. But what I loved about him is that he was at his best in every single big game. Ohio State, he showed up. The college football playoff, he showed up in both games too. So that's what you want to see. And for whatever reason, the NFL is really weird about not drafting nickel corners until the third or the fourth round. So he's one of those players that's probably going to go somewhere in the third round, and everybody is going to be saying 2 to 3 years into his career, man, why didn't he go early to mid second round? So the NFL is really weird about where they project or draft nickel corners, just because those shorter corners always worry you a little bit, especially when they lack length, like Sanders still does. But I mean, the third round, I think that's probably where he ends up going. But if I were a GM, I feel comfortable taking him on early day 2. I wouldn't have a problem with that at all.
Yeah, I think certainly he, as well as a lot of the, Big Ten SEC corners in this draft, are going to make a lot of teams come happy in this draft season. So, finishing up here, I'll put you kind of on the clock. I'll give you the Chargers GM hat. You're at 5, and you obviously have said that you would have traded back. But I'll put you in a stick at 5 scenario. given how the first 5 picks have or first 4 picks, I should say, played out in your mock draft with 3 quarterbacks and Marvin Harrison Jr., what would you do if you had to stick and pick at that position instead of trade back?
I would take Malik Neighbors. I think the world of Neighbors. I think he's exactly what this offense has lacked from a dynamic standpoint. And the Chargers really struggled to generate explosive plays last year. But from day one, as soon as you put Malik Neighbors into this offense, you know
Right.
you're going to have explosive plays right away. And Justin Herbert needs that young piece to be paired with. And we've seen that throughout the league. Whenever you draft a young quarterback, you have to pair him with that dynamic receiver. And I think wide receiver is a priority position now. It's a prime position now. And everybody says, quarterback, edge rusher, corner, offensive tackle, those are usually your 4 premium positions. But I think wide receiver is a premium position now.
Yeah, wide receiver is definitely a premium position with how the draft's been going the last few years. I, count on my hands every year, like how many top, 10, 11 guys I might have in my top 50 wide
Yeah.
receivers,
Yeah.
right? And that's been sort of the talk this year of having, it always feels like after the combine, it's like 7 wide receivers are going to go in the
Yeah.
top, 45 or something like that. And that's just kind of how it ends up playing out. And I think Neighbors, to your point, is kind of one of those guys that, especially given how the Chargers kind of operate with, Keenan, who's been playing slot outside and kind of rotates in there. Neighbors kind of is more of slot from where his production came through in college, but he can kind of rotate there as well. They have Josh Palmer on the outside, assuming Mike Williams doesn't return. But I just think they can have a lot of versatility in their offense too if you get a Neighbors into the fold for sure. So I guess gut feeling, and this is kind of a question of your, mock draft. What do you think is the overall, I guess philosophy for the Chargers in this mock draft in terms of, the positions they prioritize and, what draft haul they'll kind of end up by the end of it?
So I believe they have all original 7 of their draft picks right now, but it wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
surprise me if they end up coming out of this draft with somewhere between 9 to 10 picks, just because there's going to be a lot of roster turnover. And they're in such a bad situation cap wise for now, which can change with the move of some players. But I think they're still in a position of where they need quantity of picks right now. Eventually, once you get to where you're feeling like a contender, then you're worried about the quality of the player. But right now, they really need a quantity of picks, and they have to hit on some young players just because they have some expensive players at some spots. And they're going to have to get some young players that are cheap or cost controlled right now at some premium positions. So we talked about wide receiver already with Keenan, with him having a hefty price tag right now, which could come down with a restructure or an extension at some point. So taking Malik Neighbors there would be great. Edge rusher is another. With Joey Bosa battling some durability concerns, I think you have to get somebody for the long haul there, depending on what happens there. And then, of course, cornerback as well. So just getting the quantity of picks at some premium positions, it wouldn't surprise me if they come out of this draft with 9 or 10 draft picks before it's all said and done.
Yeah, I think that is probably the way to go with how maybe old their roster is at some of those positions and, overall the, cost controlled nature. And yeah, it sort of reminds me of kind of what the Rams did last year,
Yeah.
where they ended up having, after saying fuck them draft picks for years, they ended up getting as many draft picks as possible. And that kind of, turned them around into this younger direction. And I sort of think that's also what the Chargers need to do in this instance. So we have 50 days until draft day. Jordan, how are you feeling
Good.
as we turn the
Good.
corner?
I'm ready. I'm excited. This is going to be a really, really fun draft class.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on the show, Jordan. And as always, to everyone out there, bolt up. And I hope for Marvin Harrison or Malik Neighbors at 5. But that's my dream. So see you guys next time.